Hi, I'm Helen Vincent. I'm a Senior Rare Book Curator at the National Library of Scotland, and today I'm going to talk to you about some women writers who were Scottish, were contemporaries of Jane Austen, today are not so well known as her, and what I'm going to do is tell you about who they were and why they're just as interesting and why they're worth reading. You've probably heard of Sir Walter Scott. He's certainly the big name of that period, but before Scott was writing, there were several women who were bestsellers who influenced him, whom he admired a great deal, and I'm going to start by talking about one of them, Elizabeth Hamilton. Like a lot of the women I'm going to talk about, she was not just a writer, but she was also interested in good works, in philanthropy, in helping the people in the society around her. Elizabeth Hamilton was born in 1758. Hamilton had a very brief education and left school when she was a teenager, but she became a great reader. She was fascinated by moral and educational philosophy, and of course Scotland during the Enlightenment period was absolutely the place to be interested in those subjects. She read all the great thinkers of the day, and she became an expert and an enthusiast on the subject of education in particular. She wrote several other books about contemporary society, but in 1808 she wrote the novel that she's best known for and which was most successful. It's called The Cottagers of Glenburnie. The Cottagers of Glenburnie is a story about Mrs. Mason, who has spent a lot of time living away from Scotland, and she's come back to stay with her relatives, the McClarty family, in a little Scottish village. And the McClarty family and Mrs. Mason are absolutely opposite. Mrs. Mason is very well organised. She likes things to be clean and tidy and neat. The McClarty family, their catchphrase is, "I couldn't be fashed." In other words, I can't be bothered. And when The Cottagers of Glenburnie was published, the McClarty family became instantly famous throughout Scotland. This catchphrase of "I couldn't be fashed" became was on everybody's lips. Everybody was saying it. Glenburnie is far from a model village. It's dirty and it's run down, and when people are faced with trying to improve it, they all have this attitude of "I can't be bothered, what's the point? Nothing's going to change around here." And Mrs. Mason is very determined that she's going to change this situation and make it clean and tidy and organised. And this is where I think today it's worth noting, she thinks the villages in England where she's been living are all clean and tidy and organised, and she wants to make Scotland more like that. And we have some contemporary visitors to Scotland from that period who came and said it was just like the Cottagers of Glenburnie, and then they came back a couple of years later and said, "This book has really revolutionised the way people behave. All of these cottagers have read this book and now they're all clean and neat and tidy, and they've improved themselves." So The Cottagers of Glenburnie is a very influential novel, not just read by the Edinburgh elite, but it's also read throughout Scotland. Editions were prepared especially to be sold to cottagers themselves, which is quite unusual for a novel at that time. The next author I'm going to talk about had a very different life to the very independent Elizabeth Hamilton. Mary Brunton was that rare thing among novelists. She was a happily married woman who wrote books. There are very few of them in the history of English literature, but she was one. She was born Mary Balfour in Orkney in 1778, the daughter of a distinguished military family. And when she was 20, she eloped with a clergyman, Alexander Brunton. He went on to have a very successful career. Happily married, she became a good minister's wife. She, like Elizabeth Hamilton, was concerned for people around her. She was concerned with her parishioners. She also began to write, at first for personal amusement, but after a conversation with a friend who said, "You must publish," she finally said, "Well, I'll be serious about this," and produced Self-Control, which was her first novel. Published in 1811, it was an immediate hit. It went through 4 editions in its first year of publication alone, so it was hugely successful by the standards of the time. Mary Brunton said that she wrote Self-Control, and this is a quotation, "to show the power of the religious principle in bestowing self-command." That sounds like a very moral and worthy tale, but the book is a fascinating story of female character. Laura, her heroine, starts off as an innocent girl in a remote Scottish village who thinks she's engaged to the perfect man and discovers that he's anything but the perfect man. And so she has to leave the Scottish village and embark on this long journey which takes her to Edinburgh, which takes her to London, which finally takes her to Canada, and learn how to be independent. She has to learn who she can trust. After Self-Control, Mary Brunton wrote a novel called Discipline. So it's another sternly moral title, it sounds, but again, it's got a very strong female heroine, Ellen. Unlike any of Jane Austen's heroines, when these women are short of money, they think about how they can earn. And so Laura has a job in London, Ellen has a job in Edinburgh. My third novelist is Susan Ferrier, and if you've heard of any of these women, she's probably the one you're most likely to have heard of. She's sometimes called the Scottish Jane Austen because she writes about exactly the same class of society, the gentry, and she's very, very, very funny, very satirical, very witty. Susan Ferrier was born just around the corner from the National Library in a house in Lady Stairs Close before she moved to George Street in the New Town. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer, and she never married. She kept house for her father from the age of 22. She was well acquainted with Walter Scott. He knew her, he knew that she wrote books, and he commented very favourably on her as she conformed to his picture of the ideal authoress because she wasn't, as he said, a blue stocking. Susan Ferrier's father was legal agent to the 5th Duke of Argyll, and it was through visits to the Duke's estate at Inverary that she gained the knowledge of the Highland life and landscape that would fill her books. Susan Ferrier began to write almost as a joke with her best friend Charlotte Clavering. Charlotte soon stopped writing, but Ferrier continued, and what she was writing became her first book and her funniest book, Marriage. Marriage was published anonymously. One of the reasons for that was because people at the time thought young ladies shouldn't necessarily be authoresses. Women shouldn't have a role in public life. But one of the other reasons was that some of her characters were instantly recognisable as portraits of real people in the society of the day. And in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh, when Marriage was first published, the talk about which character was which real-life person was all the rage. The most Jane Austenish part of Susan Ferrier's writing is the opening of Marriage. It describes the spoilt English heiress, Lady Juliana, who's brought up to do nothing but look beautiful and play with her pug dogs, and how she elopes with impoverished Scottish younger son Henry Douglas and is shocked to find that she has to go and live in what she sees as an utterly decrepit Highland castle remote from civilization. So Marriage is an interesting novel because it begins where novels usually end, with a marriage, and it goes on to say, well, happily ever after in real life doesn't happen very often. Susan Ferrier published 2 other novels, The Inheritance and Destiny. They're less well known than Marriage, and I think they're further away from Jane Austen's kind of writing. If anything, I see Susan Ferrier as a precursor to Charles Dickens. She writes the same kind of long, complicated novels. There's a secret in the background, there's a complicated family history, there are lots of characters who are really eccentric, funny, very well drawn. The dialogue is brilliant. The last novelist I'm going to talk about is somewhat later than Jane Austen, but I snuck her in here because she's my own personal favourite of these writers. Her name was Katherine Sinclair. If you've heard of her at all, you've heard of her children's book, Holiday House, which was one of the first children's novels to show children as being noisy, dirty. She was quite moral, but the stories she tells, the children get up to all kinds of mischief. They go up to Arthur's Seat and have a picnic and fall all the way down to the bottom. They break furniture. They're always getting into trouble. But Katherine Sinclair also wrote novels aimed at grown-ups. And 2 of them in particular deal with the education of young women and their arrival in society. Modern Accomplishments asks the question, what does it mean to be an accomplished woman? Is it somebody who's well educated? Is it somebody who's clever? Is it somebody who can make a good show in society? And along the way, as she tries to answer this question, of course her answer is that it's somebody who's very moral and upright and a decent person. She creates this gallery of really fascinating characters and has them interact in all kinds of engaging ways. She was very philanthropic. She was interested in schools, she was interested in girls' education and other charities. When she died in 1864, a monument was erected to her by popular subscription. And I think it's kind of symbolic of the fate of these novelists, that where Sir Walter Scott's monument is in Princes Street, it's 400 feet high in splendid isolation, a national landmark. Sinclair's 60-foot memorial is forgotten and overshadowed by trees. One of the questions people often ask is, well, if these women are worth reading, why have they been forgotten? Why have I never heard of them if they're so good? And my answer to that is there are a couple of reasons. The first is, I think people tend to see the canon, the set of works that are seen as encompassing great English literature as only having room for a certain number of authors. We have a woman writer from the beginning of the 19th century, Jane Austen, so it's very hard to make room in the canon for other women writers of that period. We also have a Scottish novelist from that period, Walter Scott, and of course he was a huge figure whose influence ranged over Europe. It's impossible to underestimate how big a name Walter Scott was in the culture of the day. But because we have a woman novelist and we have a Scottish novelist, it's very hard to make space in the discussions about literature for Scottish women novelists of that period. I also think they said some uncomfortable things about Scotland. Susan Ferrier and Elizabeth Hamilton made no secret of the aspects of Scottish life that they thought were worthy of criticising. They thought Scottish villagers could do more to improve their lot. They thought that the feudal system, which was still sputtering in existence in the Highlands, needed reform. The third reason why I think these women fell into obscurity was because they are all explicitly religious. They have a strong Christian faith. It does come through in their novels, and some people find that hard to take. But I think it's possible to see it in the historical context. I think it's possible to read through it. It's possible to skip, I have to say, long passages of religious discussion or moral discussion, or long passages of description which are not to our taste, although they were very fashionable at the time these people were writing. I want to finish by saying I really hope you go on to read some of these novels. As I said, I think they're all funny. They all create memorable characters. They all have a way with words. I think they're all very good with dialogue. They're also very different. Today, the easiest way to find these books is online. If you like stories about independent women who have adventures, then you need to read Mary Brunton. If you're interested in a detailed portrayal of different aspects of Scottish life at the beginning of the 19th century, then read Elizabeth Hamilton. If you want a Scottish take on Jane Austen, a Scottish take, I think, on Charles Dickens as well, then pick up Susan Ferrier. And finally, Katherine Sinclair. I think she's probably the most readable of these novelists. She's the most modern in her style. And if you like Downton Abbey, you'll like Katherine Sinclair.